Joshua Hansen is the creator of Academiology, which seeks to unconceal the inner logic of academia and its effects on our world. You can find more from Joshua at academiology.net, on Twitter at Academiology, and on YouTube. How are we doing, Joshua?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks very much for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks for your time. This is a big subject in philosophy. There's probably, a million books on, what is education, all that sorts of things. There's a lot of political opinions on the universities and, and how they're kind of hotbeds of, neo-Marxism and all this sort of stuff. So it's good that someone's taking a bit more of a different approach to what's been done before. So in your own words, could you tell me kind of the meaning of this term academiology?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've kind of been reading in the area of philosophy of education for about 6 years. And in that time frame, I was trying to understand what the heck is going on in the contemporary university system, particularly in the West, particularly in the US, but also, elsewhere and in the UK. And basically, I was only able to kind of get snippets of the overall picture from here, here and there. So I decided to kind of put together my own doctrine, which, it definitely was named with tongue in cheek. But nevertheless, kind of what I'm aiming to do is bring together the sociology of higher education with the history of ideas, with the meta-narrative of the Western intellectual, also with critical university studies and critical theory to try to do a philosophical anthropology and analysis of the university, the figure of the academic, kind of as it is unfolded in history. And this whole thing kind of, the first move to this would be, suspending belief in the sort of absolute authority of the academic judgment, kind of in a spirit of openness. And kind of the aim here is to create a clearing for thinking, which is something that at the present moment, I think can only be achieved through destructuring, at least ideologically, philosophically, the contemporary university system.
Yeah. So that's essentially when you're talking about unconcealing this inner logic of the academy. One possibly quite pedantic question, but you go on to say, and then analyze the effects on our world. A kind of pedantic question is, when you say "our," does this apply to all people? Is it just intellectuals, or perhaps it's just those who are duped by the academy or something like this? Like, who does that apply to? Who is academiology useful for?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. That leads me into kind of an insight that I would want to bring out right off the bat, which is that I think that reality is one of the largest counterfactuals to academic self-understanding presently going. And this would be like, if you look at Ivan Illich and like Deschooling Society, he makes this point right off the bat. This is from the 70s. I still think it's valid today. The idea that somebody is going to a university and paying basically an amount of money that constitutes something like more than the life income of half of the world's population or something like this in order to solve exactly that problem. So kind of this is a system that is very much embedded in, purportedly trying to solve many of the issues that it has caused in the first instance. And, so who is it for? I just wanted to kind of get that out there right off the bat. As far as who it's for, obviously, these sorts of subject matters, I think it's going to be mostly people that are familiar with philosophy. Maybe as I gain an understanding and kind of move forward down the road, I can start to try to articulate this stuff in a way that is, more understanding friendly. But, if you're talking about Deleuze and, Pierre Bourdieu, that is an issue there. And there's actually a critique of this idea by Jacques Rancière. This is the idea that, there's people excluded from these structures of power, such as the university. these people, in many cases, they don't even know why they're excluded. But now you have the issue of the only person who may know this is what his critique was. It's the idea that the academic sociologist is the one who now knows this. Now, because I am somebody who, I'm not in a PhD program, I've never even applied, I'm not in a university, I've never actually done a proper academic role. I think I kind of elude that particular criticism, but obviously this is still in motion, so I'm not quite sure what the end game is.
Yeah, and that's something I really appreciate about your project, which sets it apart from, like I said, the traditional analysis of education, the academy, and all the political stuff we're hearing today. And I guess that's kind of the critical distance you wanted to keep. I'm just wondering, kind of from your perspective, I'm just wondering what ideologies you think kind of are critiquing the academy, and in what ways do you think they fail? I mentioned, the quite the repeated Petersonian line of the bloody neo-Marxists in the university, but I don't know if you think there's any other kind of interesting ideological, critiques we should be aware of.
I definitely do not think that it is really, I don't think that there's much to do with Marxism at all. It's like, if you look, maybe let's say in the early 2000s, there was like 6 standard critiques from both sides of the ideological spectrum that you would say. From the left, you might see discussion of, corporatization, which is absolutely a problem, the commercialization of higher ed. You might hear discussion of the, 7. You might hear discussion of the fall of the faculty, to the sort of admin being elevated, these sort of zombie bureaucrats. And then also, you would hear just kind of, standard critique of neoliberalism, while at the same time, the figures on the right have tended to focus on multiculturalism, moral relativism, and something that's escaping me right now. But, you kind of hear these culture war cliches over and over again. Maybe I'll think of that last one. Nevertheless, I'm pretty sure that all of these are very much actually connected. Under the same sort of globalizing, neoliberal state ideology powered by techno-capitalism. And, that's basically what it is. The corporations have certainly exerted tremendous power, over these institutions, whether we're talking about the student loan sharks or we're talking about like biotech, getting involved in such things as, which way research is headed, to, basically tenure decisions and things of this nature, the licensing of intellectual property and so on and so forth. What I find interesting is that the only coherent argument that I have seen out of, I've looked at a lot of texts on education, from the ridiculous to the very good, and the only coherent account of the contemporary academy that I've seen was called The Perfect Mess by a gent at Stanford. And he's trying to basically argue that the university system is a powerful economic engine. And that itself is something that I think is kind of a problem, this economic optimism, corporate thinking, and so forth, and, an emphasis on vocational training, instrumental reason, and so forth. This is basically the opposite of what education would actually entail. And, that is very contrary to, this is something, education's had many meanings, and the university has had a number of justifications, over the historical epochs, whether we're talking about an emphasis on virtue, piety, culture, excellence. We've seen these transitions, but we're finally at the point where, it is fully hyper modern, in the sense that there's no coherent justification for the university as it stands at all, really, other than as, an alternative use, which is that it served some useful purpose, which is, obviously, this has to do with, the commercial world. So the hard-nosed world, the practical business, rather than, something like moral self-cultivation and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like um, your kind of acknowledgement of capital and how it kind of absorbs everything is really useful here, as opposed to, the what is education, epistemological sort of arguments, or the more ideological stuff. I really like your language around using calling these places like vocational training centers, because it does feel like that. And I think it's really interesting to contrast this place we've ended up with, these being training centers for bureaucrats, against something like you said came out of the left, which is critical studies essentially, which was an attempt to escape this neoliberal capture, and it completely failed. They've become these critical studies departments and disciplines, have become just as bad as the ivory towers they wanted to replace. As much as they waffle on about critiquing structures of power, as more and more people seem to exit these institutions, and the social and like the social and economic currency of these institutions becomes debased, they increasingly seem to goose step with the institution as opposed to critiquing it at all.
Absolutely, 100% agree with that. And kind of the way I see that is that I think a lot of what goes on is, the stuff that gets selected and, promoted, advanced, and so on and so forth is actually stuff that truly advances the technical system rather than critiquing it. So that's kind of mostly what you see. I have this idea, you ever heard of this thing, consilience, by like E.O. Wilson, where he was basically, what he was talking about is this sort of, you have the discussion of the two cultures going back to C.P. Snow. So he's talking about the two cultures, the humanities and the sciences. So now kind of E.O. Wilson was weighing in on this several years ago. And what he's trying to say is that they need to be brought into harmony, the humanities and the sciences. Now we really have, I would say, three cultures, because you have the social sciences as well, whatever you want to call those. And really what it ends up being is that, technical science is really dominating the academy in terms of funding and so on and so forth. And so I think there's actually, what we're seeing is inconsilience, in the sense that, to the extent that the humanities kind of support that overall mission, that's the vector that they're headed in. And so you get that with the post-humanities, the digital post-humanities, and so on and so forth. That's where I kind of see that vector going. So it's really total domination by technical science. And I think it's moving towards what Habermas called a rationally totalitarian society. So this would activate all the critiques by people, going from, Rousseau to Horkheimer and Adorno in the dialectic of enlightenment. And I think that is becoming even more relevant today than when it was written, perhaps.
Yeah. I feel like I think you mentioned excellence, which I don't know if this is true or not, but is that from Bill Redding's?
Yeah, it is. I think the main argument of the book, the University in Ruins, is discussing how the German idealists were kind of into culture and self-cultivation. That's kind of like the Humboldtian ideal. And we shifted from the idea of natural or national culture, consistent with sort of, the globalizing project, towards this notion of corporate excellence, which is kind of like a vacuous, very vacuous sort of thing. There's also something highly unusual, is that you'll see theorists or philosophers of education start making arguments where we went from culture. See, I think we're beyond excellence now. We've gone from culture to excellence Two, now we're at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And really the purpose of that is to deal with the fallout of the excellence. That's how these things kind of come into being.
Yeah.
The excellence was because we were moving away from culture, and you could probably play this game all the way back. But so what I'm driving at there is the idea that now there are, kind of theorists out there saying we need to get back to this hollow corporate ethos of excellence, which was basically, in some ways somewhat meaningless. It's become a business buzzword, that I guess is used in faculty meetings and in these documents and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I think maybe you disagree with me here, but I feel like we're really kind of building a bit of a genealogy here as well, because the dominance of the technical subjects probably served a utility when sciences were becoming, actually useful for the the imperial powers, this sort of thing, right? And then all of a sudden, the humanities kind of have to roll over and accept that they're now second place the technical subjects. And then you end up in a world where, when this is still present today, where, someone who's, a humanities subject person will see, some sort of, paper that might be peer reviewed, but will have, something complex in it, like numbers or charts or a graph. And, it's either like, the pretending to understand what I'm reading, or it's the, oh, I don't know any of this. And then it's kind of, okay, I leave that to the scientists, as we say, right? But it's interesting how, our empirical data can be true and useful, but because we now, have these, this excellence, which I think is such a great thing that Bill Redding's brought up, which it kind of implies a system of social reputation, metrics of optimization, like the number of papers you're publishing. I'm trying to think of the specific case, but there's this professor who has publishes 5 papers a week or something like that, but they're all he's co-authoring them and they're rehashes of previous papers, all sort of thing. I'm really struggling to remember the name. And that all comes into productivity reporting, where oh, this guy's publishing 5 papers a week, he must be the best scientist in the world, right? But then we come now to the place where peer review is not working anymore, if it ever did, and it is essentially being rigged. And there are there's people all organized socially in to cite each other, essentially. So I'm not sure where that really leaves us.
Yeah, so all that stuff is being gamified. And, it seems like that's what tends to happen when people try to quantify, let's say you have something that is, that kind of developed rhizomatically, and now somebody comes in and they want to quantify this whole thing. It really, this sort of metric fixation, this one gent calls it, is something that really, it definitely kills joy, for one thing. But so now, I think that that's one of the biggest drawbacks of Taylorism, scientific management, and so on and so forth. It depends on on just pure computation, and what it does is it misses the complexities of human life, human psychology, human interaction, and so on and so forth. And that's why it always tends to fail, at least in my view. And in the meantime, that seems to be kind of the dominant ethos consensus coming out of the university system. If you're looking at Steven Pinker, he's calling for enlightenment, when everything that we see is basically a product of the Enlightenment, I would say. So he's calling for enlightenment. And then you have somebody like Benjamin Bratton is calling for planetary scale computation. Or who else do you have in here? There's at least one other character, to round this whole thing out, where they're just headed towards this sort of techno-bureaucratic, sort of system. I really think that, because of the state of, how power operates, the institutionalization of violence and techniques, that we're moving out of sort of a period that would be characterized as, like the end of history, liberal democracy, towards basically open tyranny. That is how that's the direction I think that we're headed. And a big part of that is going to have to do absolutely with, these metrics, these sorts of performance measures, Six Sigma, Agile, and all this stuff from these management gurus who in one text out there calls these people witch doctors, which I thought is somewhat amusing.
Yeah, I mean, they've got their own language, Sigma, Agile, all this sort of thing. Sounds like casting a spell or something. But I don't know if you disagree with me on this, but I almost feel like utilitarianism, which is essentially, the morals of metrics, it feels so, to me at least, it feels like inherently totalitarian, right? Because again, you're talking about the global computer, right? The assumption that, shoving more gigahertz into something or more memory somehow makes this thing, better in a way. I mean, looking at your wonderful backdrop today, you have all these, nice analog books. If we had this global computer, okay, yeah, it can store everything you've got behind you, how many billion times over, right? But what if you don't meet your, productivity optimization this month? Do you get, these things taken away from you by the utilitarian, witch doctors, perhaps? I don't know, but yeah, it feels to me like utilitarianism is a sort of tyranny. You make a really interesting connection, which I definitely wouldn't have made if I didn't read this essay that you wrote, which is between academia in the way academiology sees it and Nietzsche's Last Man. And I think that kind of ties into what we were talking about with utilitarianism. So would you mind talking a bit more about that connection, perhaps?
Sure. It seems that, because of the contemporary schema in the university, to put it in the most uncharitable way, I think that we're taking the students that are like, our best people in the society, on paper, whatever that means, and we are actively making them worse. We're basically subordinating the best part of these people to the most wicked. They come in, they basically now have mortgage-sized student loans on them, a great many number. I think it's the second largest form of consumer debt in the United States. The sticker on this whole thing is huge. So we load them up with the debt. Now they absolutely have to, go into avenues, where they're going to make that back. So you can kind of guess what that sort of trajectory is. And in the meantime, the university system, because of all the various intellectual movements that we've seen, whether we're talking about, positivism, these are all disparate movements that kind of that just are part of the same overall trajectory. So positivism, physicalism, psychologism, sort of neo-pragmatism, post-structuralism, and so on and so forth. They are, at first blush, quite disparate, but nevertheless are all part of the overall trajectory where we see philosophy being institutionalized, being instrumentalized, and also we see basically the attempted erasure of philosophy. And it is caused, this is the answer to your question, I would say, that it's caused the university system to become dominated by the luster for capital, the allure of libidinal economy, and the culture industry. And since that's what, if this is what John Dewey called collateral learning, that's what these students are being exposed to. And as a consequence of that, what is being turned out, again, the most uncharitable way to say it would be that in some instances, we're turning out what amounts to infantilized borderline narcissists. And like a number of different social psychologists have argued that. And so as a consequence, these sort of bourgeois consumers, committed to basically something that appears like some form of nihilism, corporate nihilism, if you like, are basically the equivalent of Nietzsche's Last Man, because they're not involved in overcoming. These would be closer to cultural barbarians, bourgeois Philistines, fashionable urbanites, and so on and so forth. And that's not consistent with Nietzsche's sort of aesthetic justification for life, and his sort of drive towards overcoming.
Yeah. It's, I think we've seen this progression in the West, maybe over a very short period of time, but it's quite clear to me because of the fact that we're really, falling behind lots of other places of the world in terms of innovation. And again, I'm not making any normative statement here. I'm just saying what I think these effects have had. Like innovation has fallen because, again, like you were saying, on paper, whatever, right? But people who are generally intelligent are saddled with this loan, are not given the tools to think uniquely, and thus we end up with a system where they can't take risks because they've got debt, and they have to fit into the mid-income cookie cutter mold, right? And then you have another system, especially when it comes to these odd disciplines, which I don't think are completely invaluable, but a lot of people attend university to do things like media studies, right? Where you're kind of, you get to write a thesis on, what you were watching for the last 10 years anyway. That's not learning. That's, like you said, that's narcissism. It's bizarre. And it's, I think again, like when it comes to the money thing, I think there's this idea of being on the ladder, and I mean that in terms of like, well, okay, if you want to do something with your life, you've got to attend university, which implies these debts, and you're probably going to do something intellectually or semi-intellectually, because lots of people go to university and don't spend a lot of time actually studying. That turns you into a narcissist, and that leads to things, at least in this country, I don't know about the US as much, but it turns into weird sort of, and this is definitely a kind of Marxian point, which is, it turns into like weird fetishes. Like, I understand the point of, for example, owning a house, or taking out a mortgage to own a house, but I understand things about equity and all this sort of stuff, but there's a real fetishism in culture about a house, a mortgage. I don't quite understand it, but I think we're making some interesting connections here. I don't know if you'd agree with me there.
Kind of in that same general direction is that, it appears that you're talking about this mold. There's sort of a hyperreal digital habitus that is sort of emerging, where, just for giggles here, if you look at sort of the educational theories of like Plato, and, I wouldn't say that I'm like a Platonist. I would actually critique him at the end of the book that I'm trying to write. But nevertheless, there's a breakdown between theory and practice, in the sense that, at that point, they're talking about, hey, these people are going to be the auxiliaries. They need to be exposed to sort of the bleeding edge of our, activities, in the polis. Same thing with Rousseau, who was talking about, attaining a rank that one cannot lose. Instead of that, you have a bunch of people learning basically, media studies, the art of digital sort of, or symbolic representation. And so they live in a hyper-real. It's possible that somebody could graduate, get a job, and really not have much of a clue how anything works, but they nevertheless are, hitting the button to order the fresh direct or whatever the heck it is. And so the idea here is that there's a type of, I'm trying to build a model of elite group ignorance that would apply to kind of the figure of the academic. And I don't mean that in sort of like a derogatory way. I'm just saying from like a point of Hegelian like standpoint epistemology, that basically with the breakdown in theory and practice, if like Dostoevsky is right that suffering is consciousness, you now have the people who are suffering least, who are kind of like dictating the overall sort of trajectory of the entire civilization. And this is not consistent with good leadership. It's not consistent with the common good. And I think it's something that's bad for basically those individuals, for the communities that they and others live in, as well as basically the whole world. As we continually sort of advance this same sort of technical system. And that this is one reason that I'm so interested in the analysis of the university, is because any issue that you may or may not have with society in general at this point in time is something that has probably been determined and shaped by credentialed graduates of like the world's top universities. This is certainly true in the US, where, if you look at members of Congress, it's like something that's got to be over 90% of them, are, credentialed, at least have undergraduate degrees from these top universities. And so that's where their thinking is shaped. And that's one reason that I think it's important. And there have been people who have looked at this quite systematically, but I'm trying to get all the way out there. I'm trying to go full bore on this thing. So I still have a substantially rough road ahead. I think I'm going to try to write like 3 texts on this that are, like as rigorous as possible. But it's not happening overnight.
Yeah. No, I think you've definitely taken my kind of simplistic point and made a better one, which actually, what this is doing, and you say maybe this is a normative takeaway for us, is this, is not only bad for the people who are part of this, but it's also bad for the communities around them and the systems and communities they create afterwards. It's not like, we're not in Pink Floyd, right? It's not a mold that they get pressed into and now we're all wearing grey suits going to the office. Everyone becomes interesting, right? After university, they become these fashionable urbanites, right? But they're all interesting in the same way.
Yeah, it's
like you said, it's hyperreal. It's not like a mold anymore. It's not cookie cutter. It's beyond that sort of thing.
And then there's this issue of, many people have talked about this, but the idea that kind of there's almost like a form of bourgeois oblige, where it's almost as if, the individuals, whether they're academics or, people that are part of this sort of digital class, have all of the rights traditionally associated with leadership, with almost none of the duties or responsibilities, which are deferred through the techno-bureaucratic system, because, that is basically what the nature of bureaucracy is, sort of deferral, deflection, and so on and so forth. So that is sort of another, it appears like leadership crisis. And, you can point to that in political figures in both parties, whether there's some disaster in the area that they're supposed to, be, preserving the good of that area, and they're on vacation on some island. Or they're implementing what some people might think of as like various draconian measures, and then sort of hypocritically and sanctimoniously sort of going against it at the exact same time.
Many such cases.
Yeah. So that suggests like a leadership crisis. I think it's strongly associated with academia and some of these other issues, whether we're talking about replication or peer review rigging and citation. I think that the main thing that we see is the sort of the offering of credentials in the place of competence. And that is, they say that, there's a death of expertise, but there's experts all over the place. I think it's that people just don't trust them. And whether or not they should is actually, that's a very interesting question. What is the efficacy of this sort of expertise, particularly academic expertise? And So like when somebody like Tetlock, he did an analysis of this, in terms of the cognitive styles. And he determined literally, even though he kind of went in a different direction with it, he determined that, that a lot of these, the forecasts by these experts, particularly the ones favored by media markets, are no better than extrapolation algorithms, or, and this is the amazing one, chimps throwing darts at a board. And so since that's the case, it comes down to, now we're at the point of like the demarcation problem, between science and pseudoscience, kind of, and I would theorize that in many cases, sort of academic expertise is coming in a form of a sort of highly circular pseudoscience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a real moral question as well, because if you have expertise, right, we have kind of deontological structures that have come before, such as, the Hippocratical Oath, where you're saying, like, no matter what, or just for the sake of it, I'm going to fulfill this duty. When it comes to the media experts, especially, the ones you said that would otherwise, could be filled in by extrapolation anyway, or, often make statements and then reverse them weeks, months, sometimes, days even later. It sort of makes me feel like that comes back to the question of narcissism, right? Because why would someone want to be the figurehead of an entire field on all the news channels?
Yeah, it is quite something. In his study on that, I think it's called like Expert Political Judgment. He's saying that there's sort of this triad in between, and it's quite toxic, really, in between authoritative sounding experts, sort of an attentive public, and sort of ratings conscious media. I think that's how he put it, that they are sort of locked into this sort of triangulation that tends to center, some of the worst perspectives, whereas the people that are much more careful, that use better cognitive styles, maybe less sort of ideologically, caught up in sort of like, a football style political adventures, yeah, are just less likely to to be centered.
Yeah, and this essentially brings us back to capital again. I think the words you use are ruthless neoliberal selection pressures, which I think is a good way of putting it, because those pressures do not they don't favor, they don't favor the truth, number one. Number two, morally speaking, they don't favor deontological ethics. They favor a consequential version that is a kind of vulgar consequential, because it's that consequence where, something's right if we, if our profits are going up, if our viewing counts are going up, right? And I think, they're more likely to put a sensational viewpoint to the front and publicize a sensational viewpoint, which again, when it comes to narcissism, instantiates that person as kind of a figurehead of something. And now, we have to listen to them. And, by listening to them, it's implied that we're listening to a field of study, or we're listening to, the umbrella study, science, empiricism. But that's not the truth. That's not the truth.
And then I have something that I could tack onto that I think is really interesting, is that, let's say we, particularly as it relates to academia, let's say, we have this ivory tower syndrome, where we basically have these people under conditions where theory is, separated from practice, even though that distinction may not be theoretically sufficient. But nevertheless, okay, so theory and practice. So I'll give you the quote that I like from Nicholas Nassim Taleb. Is he has this Yogi Berraism that he uses, where he basically says that in academia, there's no difference between academia and the real world, but in the real world, there is. which basically that kind of sums up what I'm trying to get at with this. But the idea here is, okay, so they already have the ivory tower syndrome. Now, they have sort of this academic appanage, the idea of technocratic meritocracy, these degrees as like titles of nobility. At the same time, they have all the rights, but none of the duties or responsibilities that, has historically come with these sorts of roles. And in the meantime, you have this issue of elite emulation. Where, for instance, let's say they're protesting something at Yale University. Now, some school that you never even heard of in your entire life will all of a sudden be in the news because they're protesting XYZ. So this would be something along the lines of, like the costly signaling of luxury beliefs or something in this avenue. And I think that when you take all of the above and you put that into one ball and you put that in motion, you're getting things that are sort of, you're getting ideologies that are very much disconnected from, practical reality. And it leads to almost like a runaway avant-gardism, is what I would describe it as. So it's almost like the more outlandish of a view that you can actually defend, perhaps the way the incentives are structured so that, you're actually benefiting from this in some highly perverse way.
Yeah. And it's this is something you definitely mentioned, which is there's kind of a simulacra within academia. And this comes back to that brilliant point you said, which was that, reality and theory are the same in the academy, but in reality, they're not. And that's, obviously maybe a bit an epistemological point, but I definitely think what you're saying, that the rights and responsibility, the rights of that are received by the academy and the responsibilities that they no longer have, I think it is possibly legitimized by some of the other studies of the academy and education as well, that talk about this sort of mythological educational past, right? This idea of, the ideal academy, or the, I'm going to avoid using the word excellent because that is wrong, and it's not even a historical starting point for this, is it?
I think it's part of the sales pitch. And so the way I've said it previously, which is right in line with what you're talking about there, is the idea, like, let's say that you are a parent saddling up to sign some checks to send your child to university. They'll give you the whole pitch, and, they'll appeal to this historical lineage and these ideas. Yes, the moral self-cultivation of your offspring, that we're going to make them into leaders or something like this. And in reality, my personal view, as far as it relates to some figures, perhaps like, let's say, in the social, well, actually, you know what, in every avenue, whether it's social sciences, humanities, sciences, I think that some of them are of the view, whether it is through physicalism, post-structuralism, whatever you want, that basically, that they either have like an error theory of morality, they believe in some form of non-cognitivism or something like this, and as a consequence of that, or that, they think that it's socially constructed, and they think that it is they who are the ones who are actually responsible for constructing that morality. So on that view, the figure of the academic, I've likened the academy kind of at this point in history. I believe, it starts with Plato in Hecademos. That's where you get academia from. But now basically it's become enveloped by Plato's cave. And so therefore, there's like an unmasking of the figure of the academic, at least not all, but the ones who subscribe to this sort of distinctive viewpoint I'm trying to lay out here, where they believe that we create morality, like literally. Those have taken on the role basically of these sorts of shadow puppeteers in the cave, manipulating the shadows. Basically, this is it's almost a type of charlatanry, neo-shamanism, classical sophistry, if you like.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't know if how committed you are to that analogy, but to me, at least, it's not entirely clear who is watching the shadows in the cave. Is it the students? Is it the academics? Right? Because as you said, there's
the way I have it personally.
Yeah.
I've been looking at book 7 of the Republic like in the past week. I was revisiting it, and so I really think, hey, these characters, they've been in the cave their whole lives, right? Shackled in there. The way I have it is that basically, okay, compulsory sort of mass education, or at least for many people. B, you have these student loans where now it's basically there is a bouquet of flowers over these sort of economic shackles. So the students are chained in there, and then maybe some of the professors are as well. But nevertheless, the sort of figure of the academic that I was outlining there, the one who believes that they personally socially construct morality, and that is how it goes. That there's no other sort of there's no other source to appeal to. There are no sort of external stance that can be taken. That is an individual that I think are they're the ones they're the puppeteers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So something that you bring up a couple times is the idea of presupposition in terms of what university is. I've mentioned the kind of mythical, educational past. I'm just wondering what kind of like other interesting presuppositions you come across in terms of what people are assuming about this idea.
It's amazing, some of this stuff. I said that I think that reality is like the biggest counterfactual to academic self-understanding, but this is the part where I would start harping about. Basically, you could launch one of the critiques that they do of, like, for instance, development, right? Where you have individuals basically doing PowerPoint presentations in oak paneled boardrooms, nibbling on charcuterie boards and sipping lattes, but nevertheless, will tell you that they're trying to save the world.
Yeah. This is the funniest thing, is like the only people who complain about gentrification are the people who moved in.
So like you have that. I think that the most personally, like the most outlandish thing that I've seen is like the sharpest rhetorical thing that I've seen is there's a text by a guy who was a provost at, I think, like Columbia, and the name of the text, if you can believe this, I think this is really quite something, is called "Towards a More Perfect University." I mean, this is really that's really saying something, right?
We've gone beyond excellence. We've gone through excellence, and now we're in perfection. But we can always make it more perfect, right? It's amazing the things that are generated by this bureaucracy. But yeah, it's really bizarre.
And on that one, there is a terrific book. It's called The Fall of the Faculty. I'm trying to see if I can remember the author's name. I'm not sure where the heck I have this baby, but this is a great book. As far as how the actual sort of professors have been overwhelmed by these like outsized bureaucracies. But one of the anecdotes he had is where he talks about some committee of administrators held a sequence of meetings to figure out how to improve student experience, and they came up with 30 recommendations, which, if you boiled those recommendations down, this committee of administrators determined that the best way to improve student experience was to hire more administrators. So that's cute. So, you get stuff like that, so on and so forth. I'm very committed to taking this all the way to, and so I would say, like, the most extreme thinker that I found so far, it's getting almost to the point where I'm going to have to start employing like safe words, particularly if I'm talking to somebody in academia. I was thinking that no tenure would be a good one. But so like Paul Virilio is somebody who literally wanted to create a hospital for science at this point, because he's basically doing a reading of the fall of man in Genesis and saying that, like, if we continue on the current pathway that we're on, through technoscience, through sort of like an irrationally structured university, this in the sense that it is seeking like knowledge inquiry instead of wisdom inquiry and leading to basically like an information bomb, we're going to end up being exiled. Like we're literally going to have to evacuate the planet. And like, that's not because there's like, I think even Hawking at one point was talking about exoplanets. And so there's scientists who believe like, yes, we'll be safe once we get to our exoplanet. So whether we're talking about climate disaster, the potential for thermonuclear death and destruction, or being exiled from the planet, those are themes that are very much caught up with, military industrial complex, the like big pharma and sort of academia, little nexus there, and this whole assemblage of issues.
Yeah, I'm just gonna put my, connecting the dots over a very wide distance hat on now and just say that, talking about the fall of man and Genesis, I'm just going to point out that the biggest computer company in the world is called Apple. So.
and then in the meantime, they want to implement planetary scale computation. Who was the other person I was thinking of there that should run this out? Bratton, Pinker, and then there's got to be at least one more figure that I put into the same sort of category that really exemplifies the way I think things are headed. And I think that this is all basically, a product, like it follows directly from the Enlightenment, I would say. Also, like, the transhumanist project, that as well. And that's tied up with sort of the scientific medical community and so on and so forth. But yeah, so Virilio, he wanted to put together a hospital in order to deal with some of these issues. I think in many cases that, hey, that's a pretty charitable suggestion. It's a, pretty thoughtful suggestion, a hospital for science. But I think in the US in particular, that a lot of these universities have become akin to racketeering influence, corrupt organizations. And that basically
a hospital for science, I'm a bit confused by the meaning of that.
So am I, but this is a friend. This guy's French, so like he was critiqued in.
Do we send the scientists there? Do we send the research papers there? What are we sending them?
That does raise the question of who will educate the educators that Marx kind of put there. But yeah, Virilio, he is what is it? He is French, so it's like he was criticized in the book Fashionable Nonsense, for some of his employment of scientific terminology or things along those lines. Aside from that, I think that he's got some of the most radical stuff that's out there, particularly on administration of fear, information bomb, and then he's got a book called The University of Disaster, which is obviously why I was attracted to it. But so thus far, I think that's as extreme. That's about as hard as it exists out there, and I am trying to develop the extreme hardcore.
Yeah. I'm really hoping this kind of builds up to a Luther moment where you're pinning your essays to the doors of great institutions, or great with these inverted commas, by the way.
That was considered at a certain point in time, but it is what it is. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. So maybe
it'll be an email.
Right. Yeah. But then with that, you're leaning into the techno-capital part. So I say that's true. Return to tradition and start, pinning things to doors again.
I like it.
Yeah. So maybe we could just move on to something else that I'd really like some more explanation on, is the idea of inverted Platonism. I hope I read you correctly where you say the university system is a sort of inverted Platonism, or actually is inverted Platonism. Maybe you could just talk a bit more about that.
Sure. What's interesting is that Nietzsche I forget precisely where, it might have been in his unpublished notebooks, explicitly stated that his personal philosophy was inverted Platonism. And, the reason why is because he's trying to use the aesthetic justification for life, and he's critiquing Socrates, Platonism, so on and so forth. So basically, Heidegger's course on Nietzsche, what he says is that basically inverted Platonism is basically positivism. And this is where sensuous being is truth. The truth is the sensuous. That's what he says. That's what positivism entails. So taking from that, largely speaking, I would say that the university is definitely committed to a form of positivism. But even in the post-structuralist guises, you still have like the decertification of morality and so on and so forth, because like reason and the good are no longer considered to be entangled or what have you. So as a consequence of all of this stuff, basically you have the Platonic system, outlined in the Republic. So Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies basically said that the Platonic system leads to fascism. That's what he says. And, I think that there's some truth to that. You see sort of an emphasis on militarism there, where it's saying, they're talking about philosophy and abstract philosophy, the ideas, how it applies to sort of like war fighting and so forth. Mm-hmm. So you do have that. You have censorship on that system, because they're excluding art. This is why people had to write a defense of poetry and so on and so forth. But in its, so here's the question that I would want to pose without necessarily embracing Platonism as a political or educational project. The question would be, so if Platonism leads to fascism, what happens to if we invert that exact same system? Because that's what I believe that we've done. And I think it leads to a rationally totalitarian society headed towards open tyranny. And so, I'm going to have to do more theorizing on that, but you can see the exact same structures as the Platonic system, just basically where the auxiliaries or the guardians or auxiliaries of capital rather than a virtue. There's a division of labor by technocratic meritocracy. This is similar to the, the Platonic system. You have censorship that arises in the form of cancel culture. So that's consistent there. And then finally, there's also a noble lie, which would be the cult of education, and perhaps even the idea that student loans will set you free in some sense. Yeah. So I think that it maps on almost perfectly. I think that an inverted Platonic schema is the best way to characterize the academy. It's certainly not something that's consistent with Marxism. I don't see it being, even though in the sort of culture war cliches, you'll see allegations of Marxism, and then whatever else you'll see. This is inaccurate, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it seems listing out the things that we end up with when it comes to Platonism or inverted Platonism. There's a lot of similarities between the rational tyranny and the fascism, right? Because we've ended up with this horseshoe, right? Yeah. And we have to choose a direction. Either way, we end up with essentially the same thing. What would an alternative look like, and how would we get there?
Yeah, so as far as what's your alternative? I haven't fully made it to that point, but I do have some ideas, which are one that it depends on whether or not you think that in the Platonic system they think that they can manifest the truth, and that there is that it's like transcendent, and that you can actually you can actualize that as a society. In inverted Platonism, you think that it's immanent. But then the funny thing is that the university system acts as some sort of transcendental signified at that point. That's kind of how I think that people view it, either as a transcendental signified, or they view it as like some super parent from whom all blessings flow. So you have those
positive feedback loops,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So it would be, I think that there's definitely a need for decentralized ethics is one thing. you could have, the people that are going to be committed to, we've seen the eradication of all high values. You see this a lot of times in art, where previously art would inspire somebody towards, let's say, the heroic life, the intellectual life, the poetic life, the moral life. Basically, I see a lot of art that is consistent with the consumer life, and that's about it. The people who are going to be committed to the intellectual life, they're going to do that, of course. But, besides that, I think that there's definitely going to be a need for courage as wise perseverance, the way that it was classically theorized. So certainly courage, resistance, faith, hope, basically trying to help others, things along these lines. This goes, I know that some of your writings touch, or at least I've heard you speak on this, the idea of like quietism and, whether or not it has any merits or not. I think that there is a position that is sort of removed, reserved. But then when you look at somebody like Socrates, who, by the way, wasn't an academic, it's one of my favorite points to make. Somebody like Socrates, his death is very sort of peculiar in that he both affirmed and denied the values of the city at the exact same time. He affirmed them because he agreed to basically, kind of send himself to his death in a certain way. But in the meantime, he also did so as a consequence of like critiquing every single level of the entire society.
Yeah.
So it's kind of there's an interesting tension there. So now here's the question in terms of like quietism here. Well, he certainly wasn't quiet because he was yapping up a storm, obviously. But, it wasn't like he was taking up arms at that juncture. But nevertheless, his overall activities, if you believe he existed, which I do, because of like multiple attestation and also the criteria of embarrassment, is the idea that, he may have exhibited a form of quietism that spoke very loudly for about 2,500 something years, no?
Yeah. And I'm working on a project right now, which is really heavy on Hume. And I don't know if this is a stretch, but I would say that Hume has a sort of quietism in a similar way, right? Where, he's digging into, empiricism and talking about skepticism and, really about, what if, there's no one to perceive the world and all these really quite, I think, anxiety driving things. Because I mean, if Socrates is debating with you and jumping all over the place, it's probably like, oh god, where do I even stand? You end up with this I think you use the words axiological vacuum, which I really like as well. And it's, it is actually quite anxiety inducing because philosophy is a lot larger than us as human beings. And yeah, so the parallel I would draw with Hume is he talks about how he deals with this sort of anxiety. He talks about how, when he's done thinking and writing for the day, he goes and plays backgammon with his friends because it takes his mind off of it. And I think, quietism's got some legs in terms of, we have our intellect. We have this ability to philosophize and argue one way or the other, but it doesn't always compel us to take up arms or just deny ourselves.
Yeah, and then, there's Hume. My favorite quote by Hume is where he says, there's nothing to be learned from a professor that can't be found in books. What is it? Now, at the same time, he and Rousseau, they didn't get along too well. Rousseau, for some reason, even though I totally disagree with him on certain things, is somebody who speaks to me in some respects. Definitely. Nietzsche, even though I totally disagree with him. I don't know. I think it's a matter of temperament, perhaps. But I get a kick out of Rousseau. So the issue is that think about this, and like this is delving to, eventually I'm going to try to write about political theory. I think it's very related to all this stuff having to do with the university, is the idea that when general will was theorized, general will, popular consent, sovereignty of the people, we the people, and so on and so forth, you're at a certain point in time where the state of the technology is something that emphasizes number. It's not like you have like heavy cavalry with like knights and stuff like that. That ended up getting disrupted by like steel-tipped arrows, I guess. Now, that becomes obsolete. But so at the time that general will and popular consent, sovereignty of the people really come into their being, 18th century, you're at a point in time where number really matters, where it's like, if you only have a couple guys with muskets and I have a couple hundred, we can basically overwhelm you. We could take over Versailles, or we could back off the crown, in the U.S. and the colonials and so forth. But now the state of technics, when you think about drones and stuff like this, is at a point where it's like the institutionalization of violence, which on my view is what we call political power, is something that is it no longer requires sovereignty of the people. I don't know what the date would be on this, where you would say, hey, we may be having a shift in sort of like world historical epochs, but the case I would make is that like the Voltairean strain of the Enlightenment is something that is like reaching its fulfillment right now as we speak, and that the idea of like sovereignty of the people or general will, as theorized by Rousseau, is something that is going to become historically irrelevant, at least at the present moment, because of the technological apparatus.
Yeah, I would warn you against putting a date on that, because you'll end up like the climate people otherwise.
Yeah.
20 years will go by and you've embarrassed yourself.
Yeah.
But so you also talk about Foucault and Deleuze, which is really interesting. But quite an obvious connection with Foucault, obviously, because he talks about, societies of control specifically. What is the connection between Foucault? I mean, obviously we're talking about, this control structure, but how does that tie into Deleuze exactly?
I could be mistaken because I'm not an expert on Deleuze or Foucault, but I think that that may be where Deleuze took off from in developing the idea of the society of control, where he's thinking about these institutional apparatus, whether it is the prison, the factory, the school, and so on and so forth. There's also another model that I like, having to do. I don't know if I can remember the gent's name, but he was writing about asylums, and he was talking about the idea of a total institution. And I think that the idea of the total institution is something that is becoming increasingly relevant, where it's like, you have an ideologically homogeneous sort of site, that's almost like in some ways secluded from aspects of the external world, especially during something like COVID, or maybe not, I don't know. I just think that also is another interesting model. So, with techniques, I guess like Deleuze, think about a university under COVID where you could have people at home Zooming into class and stuff like this, but nevertheless, that doesn't change the fact that there is an ideological structure, and that they're actually being held accountable to that, let's say in their like social media activity or otherwise. Yeah. And this whole thing is on the internet, and the question would be, where exactly is the internet? Or this is a kind of switching analogies, but it's like somebody who is a digital worker working from home, who is now receiving sort of like bureaucratic emails like in their bedroom, from basically the people at work. I think some of them, what I would speculate is that they're going to end up working more hours to the point where they almost become imprisoned in their own pods.
Yeah.
It's a seeming possibility here.
And it's sort of like, this is so great, because when it comes to the ideological stuff, this homogeny is the reality behind the lie that the university tells itself, that it's either, the thing that's upstream from everything else, or the source of truth, or the source of knowledge, or, you know, we're the free thinkers, for example. And then when it comes to the, you know, the COVID thing, at least with your example, is yeah, okay, the possibility is that there's technically speaking longer hours worked, or, you know, you're expected to put more in than you would if you were there physically, because you haven't got excuses like commuting and this sort of thing. But it also blurs the line between what work is and what, you know, free time, whatever we want to call that, pleasure, or I think it's not, is it Schelling who calls it Schuler? I don't know, but that's an interesting way of looking at it. But yeah, these lines are blurred, and because it happened because of COVID, it's, you know, there you've got an excuse there for why this happened. But now this system is in place and is self-reinforcing itself. It doesn't seem like there's a possibility to remove it, really, at least not completely.
Yeah, I think it's like I've done digital work here and there before. And so the thing is that I am viewing it almost as a form of intellectual suicide. And the reason why is because, you know, it's not like hard physical labor. Now, so that's an up, but the drawback is you can do it for a longer period of time. You could do it for 12 hours a day. Perhaps, you know, the market is calling for you to do it 12 hours a day. But a lot of times, you know, depending on what field you're in, it could be that basically, you know, your mind now you have to dedicate all these cognitive resources to, you know, selling product, or, you know, whatever symbolic sort of reproduction you're engaged in. And so I think that there's basically, you have this digital leisure class. And by leisure, I don't mean that they're not working. They're working almost more than anybody else in history. They're just not engaged in physical labor. You know, and it's got its own, I don't know if there's much of a, you know, a sociology of this quite yet, but, you know, I think it definitely applies to the academic milieu. And, you know, it's kind of, it's part of one of these, you know, just another one of these vectors.
Yeah, this is, like I said, where we've got blurred lines here, because it's early days for this sort of stuff. We're currently a part of the process. But this, I mean, something you did pick out was a quote from Horkheimer and Adorno. And that was, amusement itself has become an ideal, taking the place of higher values. It eradicates from the masses by repeating them even more stereotyped form than the advertising images paid for by private interests. What's really interesting about that is that the higher values are mentioned, and, you know, Horkheimer and Adorno are specific, like, known for being a bit obfuscated in a way, but the higher values have sort of been replaced by, you know, this amusement culture, or, you know, like you said, work culture. I'm not sure. Where do you think that sort of leaves us, basically?
I noticed that it seems like you talk about stuff like nihilism and value. You know, I've seen some of your talks and essays and stuff like this.
Yeah.
And I've been very interested in this. One idea would be the idea that from this one text I was reading, it was a critique of Nietzsche's transvaluation. And it's saying that, you know, the attempt to eradicate value in one dimension or sphere is something that tends to lead to it popping up elsewhere. So kind of I'm attacking my whole program kind of has I think that I have a theory of truth where, okay, so like the way that truth phenomenologically presents itself, according to Heidegger, is unconcealment. I think that there could be a theoretical aspect here where we're talking about exteriority, and that's what actually facilitates the unconcealment, because it's not currently part of our, you know, it's not within our grasp or within our ken at that juncture. So exteriority, perhaps almost like subterranean in certain respects, in the sense that it's always already there, for said unconcealment. And basically, I think that is something interesting to the critique of the university, because, I think that there is truth there within the university, but I think that it might be underneath it somewhere. And basically, one may have to dig it out. The other thing is, I've changed my conception of what a philosopher is. So I can't presently call myself a philosopher, because if the philosopher is the one who goes back into the cave, right? And I view the university as the cave. At present, until I actually go into the cave and then try to turn people around, I haven't achieved the rank of philosopher. So I'll have to keep rolling with that.
Right. Yeah, I think the reason why I was sort of tripping over myself there is because it's not entirely clear what those higher values are. Like you said, there's underneath all of this, and this is, hopefully we're not falling into that mythological educational past or anything, but underneath all of this, maybe there is something that we can be retrieved. But like you were saying, these sorts of things, they pop up somewhere else. And I don't think that's because, if we look at it, from an economic point of view, that there's still demand for it, that sort of thing. It's just that values, and you referenced some of my writing, is that value is just dictated by how we act. We say a lot of things, and that's explicit values, but we actually coronate our philosophical values, whether we like it or not, through our action. And I think those who sort of escape what might be, what is essentially an academy of amusement, sort of a weird sort of circus of fools, to use a bit of Foucault language, we're almost sort of, maybe we're not coronating any higher values, but we're at least making an attempt to sort of unconceal them, to use a word that you used.
Yeah, to kind of, what is it? I'll cut right to the heart of the whole thing, would be something like, at the end of the day, at this point of my project, which has been going for a couple of years, I haven't yet published text, but I have a whole tetralogy that, is extensively outlined that, I'm hoping to be able to bring into being. But I believe that if we're trying to think about what the good life is, how we should live, so on and so forth, basically, I just want to, I want to convert people from the idea that basically that this is an answer that can be provided by the state of contemporary academia. And in many instances, like if an academic, not all, but I'm saying substantially, if they're looking at your face and telling you something, to put it very bluntly, you may be getting bullshitted.
Right. And I guess at that point, you probably, you've done your noble duties as a philosopher. You've gone back into the cave at that point, right?
Well, what is it? Ideally, what my personal goal is, I don't know if this is achievable or not, but, I would like to be paid, a large sum to go to Harvard.
I'm sure you'd be very popular if you did that.
Can I achieve that? I don't know. I don't, if I'm drawing from, the best materials, you know what I'm saying? Like the best sources, I don't see how anyone could object.
Right. And I suppose that's kind of maybe pulling out a normative direction of your project, because you'll there's a Deleuze quote, which is, there is no need for fear or hope, but only to look for new weapons, which you use right at the end of one of the essays. I'm not sure, what do you kind of make of that? Is that a good summary of kind of where you want to go for this? Is you're not only looking for something new, you're not trying to build something, but you're looking for weapons, you're trying to attack. You want to go back into Harvard or Yale and tell them in the ways in which this is, crazy.
Well, what is it? If I could convert a couple of people here and there from the, from the academic dogma, I think that I will have done a good turn. In terms of the weapons, that's what's funny is, so then on the other hand, you'll get the quote, about the idea that you can't destroy the master's house with the master's tools, and what the meaning of that is. I think that that's actually wrapped up in a moral claim, whereas, obviously, what man can make, man can mar. But in terms of the university, I think it's pretty clear what we are looking at, which is that we're going to get what Scott Galloway talked about, the cyborg universities, where you basically have the examples he gave. This is definitely going to be the case, I think, where it's like NYU, Apple, where these corporations are going to come in and they're going to sap, what's left of some of the brand equity of some of these places, which are basically dedicated to vocational training anyway. So it makes perfect sense. And it'll be that leading towards globalacademia.edu, which could potentially be, next to the greatest tyranny. And, from there, depending on whether or not we have to evacuate the planet, it's hard to say. But to the extent that these universities are caught up in the overall technical system that is driving everything, whether it's like financialization, the climate crisis, basically weapons of mass destruction and so on and so forth. The idea that, that basically here's what it is they actually represent a real existential threat. People say an existential threat and they don't mean it. I mean it for real, like to the existence of the human species, because of the transhumanist project, particularly if you view that through like negative dialectics like I do, to the existence of, human life, period. Yeah. Whether we end up finally, hitting the button to detonate the bomb called science, yeah. For the final time. Yeah. What precisely, what does that mean? What are our responsibilities in that light? I haven't worked that out yet, but
it seems that sort of, techno-capital extinction step, the first step for that was the kind of move to online interaction in a test totally for a while. And then maybe, some of it's been given back, but maybe the realization will be, well, it's much cheaper not to have these physical things. And that applies to, any business as well as the academy, although we know now that the academy actually is a business. So this applies kind of everywhere. And you can see this first step's already been done. I don't think it's going to be a long time until especially financially struggling universities will just say, okay, we're just an online university now.
Yeah, I can see that
probably worth more as offices or whatever, sure. Right? Then
there's actually companies that specialize in that. I thought that was very interesting. There's companies that specialize in basically turning over college and university properties for alternative use. Mm-hmm. That's literally what they specialize in, educational, whatever, capital markets. The only other point I would make about that, obviously, that's not going to be Harvard with an endowment that's bigger than the GDP of some small countries. It's just that, kind of how that baby is invested is, and this is what I think is key to sort of the moral status of our society, and what really gives the lie to sort of these the moral myths of these universities being involved in a program of equity with a $40 billion endowment, is the idea that those endowments are invested in corporations, because for instance, Yale, they have disclaimers of every sort of moral issue you could think of, almost, with the exception of one, which would be corporations that basically benefit from sweatshop labor. So, it's basically you're on campus, you're protesting Halloween costumes in one guise or another, But at the same time, these Halloween costumes are made by people on the other side of the world who have to like literally sell their lives for like cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
I'm talking for like 40 years or something like that. They're living in a barracks,
Yeah.
and in the meantime, we have this this sort of performance, this posturing and posing as if, yes, we're engaged in, like that there's some high moral purpose to what we're doing. And now here's the thing about it is, so like sometimes they'll teach, Paulo Freire, they'll teach, like the pedagogy of the oppressed. Well, if we were actually going to do the pedagogy of the oppressed, you would have to go to basically the Far East, to one of these sweatshops, because those are the people who are being like brutally economically dominated, by, and we're all complicit in this whole thing. And I think that basically this is something that probably operates very similar to, like, let's say like the 1830s, the 1840s in the US, where you have some of these abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and others, who are speaking out against slavery, but that is nevertheless like that is the fundamental basis of the, a large part of the economy at that juncture. So it's like falling on deaf ears, basically. I just don't know how it is, that these characters, many of them, let's say like administrators or, let's say college presidents, can prance about sipping these caramel macchiato ventis and so forth, and be making these utterances that they are, while this sort of thing is taking shape. It's like really freaking repugnant.
Yeah. On the costume issue, it's really is bizarre, because, the sort of person who should supposedly be offended by this costume is probably more offended by the conditions of their existence than they are some Western person, wearing a cheap version of whatever their culture is supposed to be in our eyes, right? It's really bizarre. And I really think that, all this prancing and posturing, I think it's a very human thing, because these people are captured by something that really is beyond not only their, but probably our comprehension as humans. And all this posturing is it feels kind of, because it's definitely ideologically driven. So it's definitely tapping into the biological tribal circuits. And it almost feels like it's a comforter for the situation, that if, these things are looked at blankly, academic realism, I think you call it, which is really good. Either, exit is an option, or, just giving up completely, right? It is really, really, really bizarre. So, I don't know if you have any more thoughts on that point.
No, I thought the whole thing was great. I really appreciated many of your questions. Hopefully, if I get more of this spun up, I can actually publish some of this stuff in the near future. And I'll definitely reach out. I'm going to be looking into your work, because I think that there's a lot of common threads there, whether we're talking about nihilism, valuation, things like this. So, I really appreciated the conversation.
Yeah.
And thanks for having me on.
Yeah. No, it's been really, really great conversation. Academiology.com for what Joshua's got up already. What you've got there is really great, but, I'm hungry for more. Like you mentioned that you're working on some stuff at the moment. Are you looking towards a long form project like a book, or will we see more stuff on the site? What are we going to see?
Yeah, I'm trying to do like a whole tetralogy. So I'm trying to do like 3 short books, these sort of like interventional sort of,
I'm glad you explained. I was going to ask you earlier what you meant by tetralogy, because I didn't know the word.
Basically, like, it's like 4 distinct works, and I think that I even may have something in the realm of anti-academic theory fiction, which
Okay.
I have invented, I guess.
Uh-huh.
But so those, and then I might try to do a course at some point, in the near future, and that would be delving into these issues, like going all the way back to like Francis Bacon's, what have you, and kind of how that leads, to the present schema.
Yeah, and I mean that's the great thing about your work so far, is that we've got a lot of threads here, and we're going all the way back to Socrates, and we're talking about the Enlightenment. You've got Nietzsche, and then the obvious connection with Foucault and Deleuze. I think it's got, it's really got legs, and yeah, really excited to see where this goes. Just before we wrap up, I think some of these conversations, although I do think this is a serious conversation, do get a bit serious sometimes. So I've decided to finish these conversations with a sort of weird question, which is that if you were on death row, what would your last meal be?
I guess it might be an opportunity for like a hunger strike. I think I would get one of these charcuterie boards and then one of these decadent lattes, and then I'd throw it on the freaking ground in protest of the whole academic system.
That's great. I like that you assume that you've been going to be put to death by the academic techno capital singularity, which is great to know that's the mindset you're in.
I hope not, but what are you going to do?
We'll see. We'll keep fighting, right? Look for new weapons.
Yes, sir.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Josh.
Hey, cheers. Many thanks. Appreciate it big time.